All right. Hello and welcome, everybody. It's another episode of Nerds of Legend. Again, we're doing our bi-weekly book talk. I'm Ben, as always, and to the right of me is Brian, and below me is Brendan. And unfortunately, Joel and Missy aren't able to join us this week due to a conflict. So maybe we'll get their thoughts from them later on the book or something like that. But for now, it's just going to be the three of us. I'll turn it over to Brendan right now to introduce our book this week.
All right, guys. So for this week's book reading, we're doing Desperate Measures by Clifford Faust. This is part one, or book one of Angel's Luck. Luck and the Divine are a recurring theme in this series. I'll just read the back of the book for you guys. Late on payments for his spaceship and abandoned by his crew, James May jumped at the chance to hire a co-pilot who came complete with cargo. Next thing May knew, the co-pilot was a washout, the cargo was worthless, and his ship had been repossessed by a chief in the Yesheng crime syndicate. May needed the ship to survive, so he stole it back. But if he expected to live long, he'd have to repay his debts. So he could hardly turn on a job that promised wealth, heroism, and revenge against the Yesheng. In no time at all, May was up to his neck in trouble as he and a group of deadly mercenaries planned a daring escapade with only the slimmest chance of success. Everything would have to go like clockwork, and even then only Angel's Luck would save them. Mm-hmm. I will preface this by, I told the story to Ben, I think it was mentioned in our last reading, that I got this book for $1 when I was 12 or 13, and at that time thought it was the coolest thing ever. I remember specifically a running theme of some comedy. We'll go over how it has a very different perspective now that reading it as adults, but I'll defer to our moderator for this week, Brian.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Before we get into it, I think we should talk about some of the more problematic elements with this book. Because there is a lot going on with this one where it's no bueno.
Yeah.
In short, yeah.
It's
in short, nope.
There's a little bit of misogyny going on in here. The main character does not seem to have a very high opinion of women for the most part. It gets better later, but the start of the book is a little rocky. And then also the criminal syndicate, the Yesheng, is a little bit of racism going on. So we're going to remind everyone this is a book from the 1980s. So there's a little bit of the word Orientals getting thrown around. We're not going to get into that so much, but just for anyone who hasn't read the book or is mad at us for doing this book for whatever reason, just so the little bit of disclaimer right at the top. So,
yeah, we were discussing as we were getting prepared for this podcast the historical context of the United States. Faust is American in the 1980s, pertaining to relations with East Asia. So we had talked about how at the time Japan was a major economic power, and you think about Back to the Future Part 2, you think about Big Trouble in Little China, Johnny Mnemonic, going into as late as the mid-90s. The concept of the Japanese economy potentially being the number one world economy meant that the East Asian perspective was subject of common conversation in the United States. You had anime coming over in much larger quantities starting in the mid-'80s. I mean, you saw Star Blazers, you saw Space Battleship Yamato, Gundam was picking up. Some of the first anime conventions were appearing in California at this time. So having recency in the public mind at the time doesn't necessarily mean that it was immune from ethnocentrism. And you can see the concept, the term that we no longer use today is problematic because of the concept of the other. And this book is definitely written from the perspective, the Western perspective, let's just say.
So I suppose with that out of the way, let's go into our non-spoiler territory here, and let's talk a little bit about, like, just in a general sense, Ben, what did you think of this book? Like, overall, is this something that you would recommend to a friend, where would you kind of like rate this book on like a sliding scale, like either 5 stars or ranking from like 1 to 10, 10 being the best sort of thing? Like, where would you put this book?
So I didn't think it was the worst book I've ever read. It definitely gets into that dime store like pulp sci-fi territory. It's very it's very predictable to a certain amount. It's not the most. I didn't like it at the beginning when it was just the main character May. Later on, there's other characters that are introduced, and the action kind of picks up. But the first half of the book is very like it was a little bit difficult for me to get through, and then it picked up later, and I actually found myself enjoying it. It's a quick read, so I didn't mind that too much. It was only I listened to my audiobooks at 1.25 on, and it was a 6-hour listen, so it wasn't a slog, but there was definitely points where I was like, come on, like what's going on? It was very slow. But overall, it wasn't bad. It wasn't great. Some of the stuff kind of threw me off that we've already just covered. I'd probably give it like a 5 or 6, like maybe a 6.5 out of 10. It wasn't the worst thing I've ever read. Wasn't the best, but like overall,
would you say that it was worth the $1?
It was definitely worth $1. Yeah, it was definitely worth an Audible credit, you know, like, but it wasn't like I wasn't blown away by it. But there were definitely some points where I was like, "This is good. I like this." And then there were points where I was like, "Gosh, darn it, May stop being like a lot of it falls into that sort of main character problem where like there's a lot of moments where the main character is saying, hey, we have to do this. It's just like, but like nobody's listening to him, like, and he's just like has to go out and do it his own way, which is kind of a trope that things fall into. It's definitely a main character syndrome type novel, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Brendan, we're gonna go to you. Overall, without giving any kind of like spoilers or anything like that, where would you put this book on your ranking? Is it something you would recommend to a friend? Was it worth the $1?
Yeah. I'll rate a 4 out of 4 quarters. No, just kidding. I would absolutely say that before I recommend this book to somebody, I would have to preface it with historical context for sure. Looking back on this book, I almost would only recommend it situationally. I feel like we think about does a television show pass the Bechdel test, and we think about, hey, do we have representation? This book is very much told from I'd say white male gaze, so I'd say I would recommend it with some caveats. I will also say that I recommended this book because I specifically love looking for diamonds in the rough. I love Del Rey paperbacks. I love TNG novelizations. I love specifically the D&D Forgotten Realms paperback novelizations, and just looking for quality where I guess it isn't to be expected. And I will say that this book does have some interesting themes that surpassed my expectations. It's called The Angel's Luck, May's ship in the book. There's a recurring theme that you're not supposed to name ships after divine luck and divine providence. Similar to when you go to an airport, and even today, every airport in the United States at least has a chapel because of the sort of inherent risk involved with flight. There's sort of an inherent risk referenced in space travel. And I like the idea that May is always deferring to divine providence, trying to help him get through things. When I think Ben would agree with me on this, more often than not, May's misfortunes are due to his own hubris. And I like the idea of him sort of always looking to the heavens when his problems are right in front of him.
Mm-hmm.
And the beginning of the book is a little sloggy because his co-pilot Dexter is a terrible person. And he is in a bar with him at the beginning and basically tells him, I want to have money and women, and treats them as a possession, which in itself is problematic. And so I like the idea that as May hits rock bottom, his ship is possibly going to be repossessed. His co-pilot has run off with essentially, what should have been their money, taking away his scanning system off his ship and telling him, good luck.
Mm-hmm.
That when he happens on his new co-pilot Duke, who is not technically a co-pilot, is not skilled in space travel, and is not as cool as he markets himself to be, that May is forced to be a sort of surrogate parent to Duke, and learns in teaching this far more innocent co-pilot, the skills of space travel. He becomes sort of a surrogate father, and in that sort of has to look at himself, because being a protagonist in the first half, May is not necessarily the best person. Mm-hmm. And as the story sort of shifts towards Duke and told from Duke's perspective later on, we'll just leave it at that without any spoilers. It's the classic tale of
the book gets better.
I
found it a hard time liking May, and I think that's why I didn't like the book at the beginning. And then later on, I was like, okay, I like Duke. Duke's okay. Yeah. Duke's good people.
Duke's good people. So I think I love how the back of the book doesn't tell you this, but the quality markedly improves when May is forced to sort of change. You are who your friends are, and I think that a lot of May's misfortunes were the people that he fraternized with, and as he sort of is forced into a surrogate father perspective, almost like Indiana Jones in Temple of Doom. Indy is very different in Temple of Doom than he is in Raiders. When he has Short Round around, he has to act differently. He has to behave differently. And I think from that perspective, this book has merit. With that in mind, it would be prefaced with several caveats and several disclaimers.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So what's your rating? I don't believe you gave
my rating. I'd say 6 out of 10. I'd say the fact that I have to preface it with disclaimers, I think alone, it's sort of like an excellent skateboard routine. If you fall in that skateboard routine, it's going to hit you, So I'd give it a 6.
Okay. So, without going too much into spoilers, I guess you could say, what would you guys say is the thing that you guys liked the most about the way that the story is told? You know what I'm saying? Like, because obviously, you guys both enjoy it enough to at least, kind of like stick with it and to, actually continue through some of its more problematic elements. What is it about this book that helps you to want to go past those elements to read the rest of the story?
Yeah, and
Brennan, we'll start with you.
Just as a quick aside, thanks for the follow, Waking Ava, and I'm glad you're enjoying listening. But Brennan, you go ahead.
Sure. As a person who fancies himself an artist, I would say that true inspiration from any source makes me want to try it myself. So if I watch a really good movie, and I'm like, oh man, I wonder what it would be like to do location casing for a film, or I wonder what it would be like to be a cinematographer. I remember reading White Dwarf magazine as a kid and being like, oh man, I wonder what it would be like if I painted minis. And lo and behold, I have a problem in my basement. So when I read a really good book, I always think when I was younger, like, hey, how would I approach a sci-fi, or hey, how would I write this kind of thing? And I think the merit of this book that I would be excited to tell other people is I like the way that it approaches an effortless level of science fiction. I've had conversations with Ben in the past about sort of like real sci-fi versus like high concept sci-fi, and how there's sort of there's a paradigm, there's two levels of realistic sci-fi. There's the level we're at right now, where if you're in space, you're either a billionaire, ex-military, or a PhD, right? it's high technology. It's very expensive to get into space. It's scientific and cutting edge. Then there's the garbage man in space, right?
Yeah.
There's the very utilitarian level where working class people are in space because it's inherently dangerous, but it has to get done.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And this is very much the utilitarian level of space.
I think that's what's interesting about it is it's very much like, you know, this is a guy basically trying to be an owner-operator of his own spaceship. It's the space trucker thing. He's not...
Yeah.
Blue-collar space travel.
Yeah, it's blue-collar space travel. Yeah, exactly. So, you know, he's trying to pay off his rig. He's trying to, like, you know, do his thing. And I think that a lot of times is more interesting than a lot of this, like, highbrow, you know, Starship Enterprise thing. Because it's like, this is a guy, he's by himself. He has to have a co-pilot, but, like, pretty much he's just doing he's doing trade runs. He's a space trucker. You know, he goes from planet to planet, you know, getting whatever he can, loading up with what he can, bring it to another place and try to fund the next run so he can pay off his ship and then live the high life. So
Yeah, and I prefaced this last week with the fact that I found it to be very funny. It involves a heist, it involves crime syndicates, it involves theft, and James gets punched in the face in like the opening 15 pages of the book. It's funny because it doesn't try to be. Humor is always true and real when it's inherent from the situation and when it's not forced. This book is funny because they approach James May's character almost like Lone Star in Spaceballs versus Han Solo in Star Wars. He's in his Winnebago in space. It's very I get vibes from Venture Brothers where it's like everything, you know, there's this grand plan and everything falls apart. So I think the running theme of failure in James May's life, you know, he's a divorcee. Whenever he has a problem, he immediately goes to a bar. The inherent fallibility of the character, I think, adds a lot of organic humor to the story. Duke, his new co-pilot, is basically running away from the. It hints that he might be Mormon because his family's pushing him into a bigamous double wedding, and he immediately is like, "Hey, get me off this planet." And he lies about being a co-pilot. So there's an overarching theme of incompetence that I think lends a natural humor to the book. I thought that it was very effortless. I thought that the humor was organic. And I like the idea that the science fiction is presented in a very organic, utilitarian way. I mentioned to Ben earlier, I like the Master and Commander books. I think that the movie Russell Crowe is fantastic. The books come with an accompanying glossary book, so they come with a text that is there just to tell you what the nautical terms are, because they can be that confusing. This book is not confusing. It's a fast read. All of the science fiction terms are used conversationally, so there's no time to pause and, hey, viewer, this is what space travel is like. It's very rapid fire, and you pick up very quickly.
It makes it like when they use a space, you know, like a sci-fi term, it's very obvious like what is going on. You know, like, oh, this is the VASAC. That's the navigation system, or it has something to do with calculating space travel or whatever. But
chapter 1 ends with Duke being strapped into the ship, and they're about to go into, I guess, their version of hyperspace, and May is basically telling him it's too late for me to take you back, even though I know you're not space worthy. We're just going to have to go with it. And the very end of part 1, Duke's about to vomit, and he looks at the nameplate on the ship and sees it's called Angel's Luck, and he's like, you really need to change the name. And then the chapter ends. And that's a big strength of the book. Inherent fallibility, effortless humor, and the sort of colloquial conversational level with which it explains its sci-fi, I think are the strengths that I would recommend about this book.
Okay, we're gonna jump into spoiler territory since we're about at the halfway point. But before we do, I want to give everyone the option to, you know, if you haven't read this book already, and if you're curious, if you just have an interest in sci-fi or in heist stories, or just in general, sort of that like blue-collar space travel sort of thing, you know, maybe this book is right for you, but be aware that it does have those problematic elements to it. And so, like, as a transition to kind of like move us into spoiler territory, I wonder which punch came first, the one in this book or the one that Batman gave to Guy Gardner? Because they seem a little reminiscent of each other.
Yeah, he gets one punched.
He does.
Yeah.
Basically, like he's toe to toe with this like policeman, and all of a sudden, and then everything went black.
Yeah. Yeah,
I'm thinking like Spaceman gets punched once, like like it's very like there's a callback there somewhere. I'm sure.
If you guys have any experience with true pulp fiction of the time, with true gumshoe detective film noir, it's a recurring theme that women are otherworldly and untouchable and on a pedestal. The protagonist getting the crud beat out of him. If you think of Miller's Crossing, the Coen Brothers movie, which is sort of a parody of film noir, it's a recurring theme of the protagonist getting beat up. So you have the beat up trope, you have the down in his luck, you have crossing a criminal element, you have a lot of gumshoe film noir-esque heisty themes that come up in this story. And it only gets worse. It only intensifies. We had conversations about this book being similar to sort of Big Trouble in Little China, where running afoul of the Yesheng, a criminal element, having to go onto a heist. It very quickly moves from him being a freight trucker and it being from May's perspective and going
a smuggler, basically. Yeah,
and he
goes from being the trucker to the driver.
Yes, and here a big spoiler in chapter 1 is that May's essentially forced into smuggling because Dexter, his co-pilot, while his jaw is wired shut and while he's in infirmary after being beaten, his co-pilot essentially puts it all on red, loses at the casino, then takes May's portion of the money and gets rich with it, steals his navigational equipment from his ship, which is it's illegal to fly without, and puts it in a much smaller pleasure craft like a Ferrari, and uses it to smuggle space cocaine.
I think it's more like a yacht. I'm
it's
more like it's a space yacht.
It is a space yacht. It's sort of like, I think in like Shadows of the Empire, it's like Jabba the Hutt has a space yacht. The Hutties have. It's a space pleasure cruiser that's much smaller than a freighter. He steals James a navigational system that's meant for a much larger ship so that he can watch out for space cops and so he can smuggle space cocaine. And so May is left with a ship illegally without a danger like navigational system, and he's forced very quickly to sort of make decisions that venture on the illegal. Yeah. And so that's where our story is.
That was a fun part of the book where like May figures out that Dexter stole the ship or borrowed the ship, and so he's going to like he's on this it's on this like backwards planet that's still like somewhat high tech. So he gets bounced around to like 8 different crime departments trying to like get his ship back, and they're like, oh, they left our orbit, so that's not our thing. You want orbital police. And then they're like, oh, you mean he's not in the system anymore? That means you need galactic affairs or something. And then he's like, oh, well, he took your ship under false pretenses. That means it's fraud. And then at the end, he goes through this like long list, and then finally you get to the end of the chain. They're like, oh yeah, so basically, since he took your ship with fraud under false pretenses, then that just means that we sell off the assets, and then you get a portion of what's your half or whatever's yours. And he's like, so wait, I want my ship back, and in order for me to be recompensed, you have to sell off my ship and then give me half back. And they're like, yeah, that's about sums it up. He's like, no thanks, I'll just go find him and murder him myself. And then as he's leaving the police station, Dexter finds him. So it comes back after like he's done like some kind of like cosmetic surgery to give himself like make himself a foot taller and be like this super attractive man, and he's got two ladies on. Well, it has a lady on each arm, and he's like, let's go to this fancy place.
Yeah. So that's chapter 1. Going into chapter 2, he's with Duke, and he ends up finding he has a shipment of frozen beef because Duke's family on the backwards planet ran a meat plant or
commodities brokers.
Yeah, commodities brokers, and Duke. By the way, his actual name is not Duke. It's like William something. It's very blasé, and he's very similar to the Schofield kid in the movie Unforgiven, where he hangs out with Clint Eastwood's character William Money, and when he finally kills someone, you find out that the Schofield kid had never shot someone and never fired a Schofield, and gives the revolver to William Money and says, "I don't want to be a part of this." So Duke is sort of the assumed name of this kid who wants to get off a backwards planet and be very cool. It's sort of
he gets drunk with the kid, and the kid sells him, because the kid's drunk, he sells him beef for basically like criminally low prices, and then basically the family company was only gonna get their money back at like a quarter on the credit, like, and meanwhile May gets to like sit on like 75% or something like that, and then Duke also talks him into like basically like they had two different conversations, because you'll find out that May doesn't pay attention to anybody but his own like monologue. Duke convinces himself that or May convinces himself that Duke is a licensed co-pilot, when Duke was just saying that, yeah, I have a degree from New Concordia University, or whatever the name of the planet is, and
DeVry.
He basically has a degree in commodities from DeVry University, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I've got my papers," because Duke's like just trying to make a sale, and May's just trying to find a co-pilot and a new set of new cargo, and then you get in space, and he's got the cargo for like criminally low prices, and then you find out that Duke is not a co-pilot and actually tries to leave via the airlock, even though they're already like on their way out of system. So
yeah, and May has an idea about this, because Duke is leaning against the glass, and May's like, if that glass breaks, there's explosive decompression, and then Duke freaks out, and he's like, if you were a pilot, you'd also know that stuff's tempered against collision. But you freaked out as if it would break, and he has his ideas.
Yeah.
And then Duke is so drunk that he zips himself up in a zero-G bed and is too drunk to even show up to the cockpit.
Yeah.
As we go into chapter 2, he's showing him the ropes of space travel, because at that point May's like, if I don't teach him anything, I'm out here by myself piloting, and it's inherently dangerous with a ship this big. You then find out that the shipment's not exactly good product now, do we?
Yeah. So they get to this freighter, or like it's an oil rig, I think. That's like basically a huge hydrogen fueling station for basically a refinery to like harvest hydrogen for fueling ships. So, and May's got a contact there, and he's like, "Oh, they always need food. We'll go there." And then you find out that this ship had a sort of very fortuitous crash happen near it, where they ended up with a colony ship where all hands were lost, and they had like all the food they could ever need for like a year. So like they actually had like live cows. So like they were selling this beef that May was going to sell for like a stupid amount of profit. He couldn't, like, it was like if beef crashed to like a quarter of the price, and so like they couldn't sell it, and then all this stuff, and then that's when the guy that tries to repossess his ship catches back up to them. They steal the ship because the Shang Tsung, whatever the name is. Shang Tsung, wrong name.
The Yesheng.
The Yesheng. Sorry, Street Fighter character, or Mortal Kombat, not.
Your soul is mine.
Your cargo is mine.
Yeah, your cargo is mine.
Your cargo is mine. Because he was
getting this. You will be next.
This guy that's basically a loan shark that sold him the ship was going to take it. So they stole it back broke out of prison and stole it back, because there's some sort of honor code where you can offer back a third of what you stole as sort of like an honor thing as repayment, and then they screw up that deal, Guy breaks the bad guy's May breaks the bad guy's legs by throwing a desk on him. They flee. They get back on the ship, and there's all kinds of hijinks, and that's where they encounter a mercenary who's basically like, "Hey, I got a job for you," and shenanigans occur, and now all of a sudden we go from space trucker book to heist movie. So,
which
is actually where I think that I correct me if I'm wrong here, but like I really feel like this book was probably like leading up to the heist story. You know, setting all the pieces.
It's basically like so
that
like
you know what's going on.
The whole point of the thing was May. The whole point of the first half of the book is May wanted to make his money legit. He wanted to pay off his spaceship by not selling drugs, not selling weapons. He wanted to be like on the straight and narrow the whole way, do his own thing. And that's for the reason why it's called Desperate Measures, because every single moment leading up to them agreeing to this heist is like May digging himself deeper and deeper into a hole where this only option is to basically join this heist.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with you, Brian, because it's very obvious the story is pushing May and Duke towards a heist, because you think of a very glaring plot hole when May is doing things legally. Mm-hmm. When he's buying commodities, he only ever checks the demand for the commodity when he gets to the location where he's selling.
Yeah.
They have interstellar travel. They go FTL. They have all sorts of...
It's obvious that they have interstellar communications. Like...
He doesn't check the internet. He doesn't check stock prices for any of these commodities until he gets to the place where he's selling it. It's like you could be having a cup of coffee on your planet. Be like, okay, they don't need meat there. I'm not going to fly there and sell it. Instead, they're like in space.
Maybe that's why Duke had trouble selling this load of beef anyway. It was because of this thing. That's probably why Duke couldn't offload the meat prior.
There's a good chance he lied to May just to get rid of it. Yeah. So May is not very good at the job he was doing, because he doesn't check commodities prices until he gets to the place. Yeah,
it's very obvious that May only ever wanted to be a pilot. He didn't want to be a trader. Mm-hmm. And he's bad at trading.
You think of Robert Baratheon. He loved fighting. He loved warring. And as soon as he got the throne, he had no idea how to rule.
Yeah.
May liked the idea of going to space. He loved the idea of owning his own ship. All the work involved, he was no good at doing it.
Yeah.
So then we very, very strongly shift towards a heist book, and you get the character of Lee, who I didn't listen to the audiobook, so Ben tells me that the audiobook representation of Lee is very problematic.
Yeah.
We're gonna say it's about as bad as Mickey Rooney in Breakfast at Tiffany's.
Yeah, probably around there. Yeah,
probably that. Probably like, John Wayne is Genghis Khan bad.
Yeah, that bad. I'd put it there, around there.
Bad.
Yeah,
and that's why this book can't top a 6 out of 10 at the very least.
Yeah. And so they encounter this basically what the heist is, if we're wanting to get into it, is there's this company that, as an end of life thing for all the greatest minds in, I guess they use the universe in this case because it seems like humanity is intergalactic at this point. I don't know if it's galaxy or I don't know if it's universe. But what they were doing was there was this company that was figured out how to implant memories from people into other people. So they could basically, like, when someone passes, so say they're a great mathematician or a pilot or a historian or an economist or whatever, their brain juice can be extracted.
Smooth the milkshake. Drink your milkshake.
Can be like put into like a serum enzyme that when you're injected with it, it gives you the innate abilities of the person, You know, you get some of their memories, you get their knowledge. And the whole point of it was this company was shipping these like hundreds of, like, basically it's almost like some human knowledge of people that was going to be passed down as sort of a thing to, like, all right, this guy's a great mathematician. We give him some more mathematician juice, and he becomes a better mathematician or whatever. So all these famous, you know, the universe's greatest minds were about to be transported, and the shipment was lost. But what you find out is this criminal syndicate had gotten a hold of it. And I don't think it's right to call them a criminal syndicate. They're basically like this rival nation. Gang. They're a gang. They use shady tactics, but they are their own government. But it seems like they're very authoritarian and stuff like this. They have the control of a bunch of planets that is against, like, the rest of the Federation, so to speak. And
are they the Ferengi?
Kind of. It's almost that bad, but they're still human. But they use a no word for describing them.
Oh no!
Which we're not going to use.
So they're basically this. It's like if you took. So they constantly refer to Terra as this, like, hellhole. That, like, I think at this point in humanity's history, Terra has become like a prison planet or something. That's the way it's referred to.
They refer to Terra in this book as like
the last place in the universe you want to be.
Yeah, it's like how Darren Bailey describes Chicago.
Yeah.
It's pretty close. It's like, oh, it's rife with crime and it's polluted and no one would want to live there in their right mind, and you just don't want to be there.
And that's where you'll end up if you do this, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
It's almost, it sounds like it's almost become like the prison planet of the government. And so they have this, so the bad guys have these, like, the brains, the world, the universe's greatest minds, and they're transporting it from one place to another. And Lee, who we previously mentioned, was an inside man who was going to be driving the armored car. So they gather this crack team of mercenaries to basically, like, Lee planned out every facet of his heist, and the heist starts. And obviously, this is a heist book. It immediately all falls apart because, like, Lee starts losing his nerve. The timings start not working out. Some of the mercenaries that were hired don't get along with each other. You know, bad stuff happens. All kinds of fun stuff. The heist is obviously the best part of the book. They have this crazy guy that was supposed to, like, load up this tank of. There's this, like, knockout gas, which is, I can't remember what they call it, but it's basically like this instant, like, knockout gas that they'll, like, pump cabins full with to, like, knock everyone out. But instead of putting knockout gas in, this, like, crazy, like, bomb tech guy fills it up with chlorine gas and murders the whole armored car, but in the process is killed in battle and stuff. What's interesting is, another thing that's interesting is Duke has this little, like, spidey sense going on that it gets referred to multiple times, and finally one of the mercs is like, I want you on my fire team. He's like, why do you want me? I don't know anything. I've never even fired a gun. He's like, you grew up on, I can't think of the name of the planet. You grew up on this planet, right? He's like, yeah. He's like, well, apparently when this colony was formed, it had crazy weather phenomenon and volcanic activity and stuff. So this planet was so hard to exist on. The whole thing was, like, everybody who grew up on this planet was, due to, like, years and, like, generation after generation of evolution, has developed a sixth sense for when danger is about to happen. So there's multiple points where Duke's like, the hairs on the back of Duke's neck stand up, and he's like, "Oh, this is bad." It's like, we need to not do this. And then immediately something bad happens because nobody listens to Duke.
Duke is canonically, I guess, he's equivalent to Space Australian.
Yeah, he's Space Australian.
He's Space Australian.
Yeah, and it's just funny because there's so many times, so it's like, I think that's the point where I got really annoyed with May. It was because, like, later on in the book, like, every time Duke's like, I don't have a good feeling about this, May ignores him. Mm-hmm. It's like, what are you talking about? It's gonna be fine. Bad thing happens. And then, like, every time, the next time something bad is about to happen, May ignores him again. And it gets really frustrating. I was like, at a certain point, aren't you gonna, like, listen to this guy who's apparently, like, your radar for when shit's about to hit the fan?
There are a ton of parallels of May to Doc Venture.
Yeah.
Where he's...
What are you talking about? It's gonna be fine.
yeah, he's older than all of his subordinates. He's begrudgingly a father figure. He's completely confident in his own abilities that are insufficient. And everything he touches turns to failure. It's very, very parallel. Except, he also has facial hair.
And Duke's Brock Sampson.
And Duke is Brock Sampson. He's a lot less self-confident than Brock Sampson,
right.
but he's equivalently...
He's not, because it, like, refers to, like, this dude, like, knows, like, it's referred to how big of a dude Duke is all the time. And then
he's farmer. He's corn-fed. He's farmer.
He's a corn-fed farm boy, and he can handle himself. And it's just funny because I also like when it's very much like that Heist movie thing where it's like, all right, May and Duke are like confer, and they're like, all right, do the thing. And he's like, oh, like on Vegas 7. He's like, yeah, do that one.
Yeah, it's like Nat and Hawkeye, where it's like, remember Budapest, and
yeah. That's exactly what Duke and May are, like, immediately, and they're like, I love that part, but then, like, so whenever they're planning for a fight, May listens to him, but, like, any other time, May's like, oh, shut up, I know what I'm doing.
Yeah, it's, again, there are a lot of parallels to Big Trouble in Little China, where one character is extremely proficient, and the other character is completely incompetent.
Yeah,
for some reason they're not dead, and they get through it. So yeah, and we do remind you that it is part one of a 2-part series. So it very obviously lends itself to not completing the full story. It's sort of, I wouldn't say it's a complete cliffhanger, but it's...
No, it buttons everything up nicely, but I guess they don't get the payout at the end of this book, do they?
It's a bit of a cock tease.
Yeah.
Yes. The money is not there. It's kind of like, I wouldn't say it's like Fellowship of the Ring, because that's very much like leaves a lot to be answered. I'm trying to think of one where it's kind of like Iron Man 3, where they weren't sure if Robert Downey Jr. was coming back, so they sort of tie things up with a bow, but it leaves itself open. Mm-hmm. For that reason, I recommended it. I was like, it's more or less self-contained.
Yeah, I don't know if we'd continue revisiting the series due to just the problematic nature of the book, but I'm probably going to end up finishing it at some point.
Yeah. I suppose now's a good point to kind of like put our own bow on it and kind of, like move on to what our suggestion is for next time. Sure. I believe I'm up this time, so with the month of October right around the corner and whatnot, I was thinking, what do you guys feel about Clive Barker?
Oh.
I will never play with a Rubik's Cube Clive Barker gives me, but I will certainly read his material.
Okay.
All right. Then for our next book talk, or our next book talk, I was thinking The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker.
Okay.
Now, for the fans at home, is this what was adapted into Hellraiser?
This is what was eventually Hellraiser, yes.
Okay. Very excited then. I've never read the written adaptation.
this is
perfect
what
timing,
eventually became Hellraiser.
Because we'll be getting right into Spooktober right then when we review this book. So
exactly. So that's kind of my thought process there.
Yeah, I like it.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't really talked about our next episode next Monday, but I think the Cosmic Horror one did pretty good. Did you have a topic you'd like to suggest for next week, Brian? I know I'm putting you on the spot here a little bit.
Oh, let's see here. Well, are we going to kind of continue within that same sort of like vein of like, do we want to talk about something kind of spooky?
Oh, I feel like we could. I feel like next month needs to be Spooktober. We're starting a little early, but I feel like we need to do a little Spooktober stuff. So I think we're gonna bring back some cryptid episodes. I think obviously we're gonna do a spooky book for our first October session. But
okay. Well, if we talked about cosmic horror last time, do you guys want to do something maybe a little bit closer to the Earth? Maybe something like vampires?
Ooh, we want to do some vamp lore? Just like vamp horror, gothic horror stuff? I think we could do that. Joel says yes, all spooky, so let's do some spooky. So it sounds like next week we're going to talk about vampires. Are we going to do sort of like the history of vampires? Or are we going to like,
well, that's the thing about vampires. They have a really uninteresting actual history.
Yeah.
It's only once you actually get to pop culture that they actually have, like really interesting history. Because like the whole story about vampires, and this is a story we can contain in just like this one like quick bit here, is that like the reason why we have vampires is because people didn't know how to bury their dead. And they were poor. Yeah. That was it.
And they basically buried people that weren't dead.
No, they were dead. But the problem was that like they would bury their dead in shallow graves because they were poor and they couldn't actually afford so they couldn't like afford a real proper burial.
Yeah.
And then they just didn't understand how bodies decompose. So like when the horse would like kick up the dirt and whatnot, and you would see someone and they'd still kind of like look alive. You know what I'm saying? Like they're like, oh, it's an they
didn't know how decomposition works. Decomposition takes a lot longer than what we think.
Yeah, well, especially when it's like really cold and they're like in a Hungarian winter or whatnot. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, and then they'd like believe that other people from the family, because like one person dies. And they were probably sick, and then someone else in the family gets sick. Oh no!
Some of it's
feeding off of
not understanding how like typhoid works.
Yeah, exactly.
So
the actual history of vampires is really uninteresting because it's just poor people who don't understand how medicine.
I think it's still interesting, so we're going to touch on that, but also we'll talk about pop culture vampires. You got two history nerds in the building here, Brian. So
well. I will give you the historical subcontext of Vlad Tepes and Vlad the Impaler.
Oh God, Vlad the Impaler, yeah, it's fucking
Mr. Stabby Stab.
Mr. Stabby Stab.
So,
okay.
Yeah, we're coming up on time here a little bit. So again, so it sounds like next week we're going to be doing vampires. The following week we'll be doing Clive Barker book, Hellbound Heart. As always, every Wednesday, catch us for our D&D stream. We'll be continuing our adventure through Fistandia's mansion in Candlekeep on Wednesday, and hopefully everyone finishes. And then the following week, we'll actually be adding a new player, so stay tuned for that. And then also, I don't know if it's too soon, but we are doing in mid-October, we're going to be doing a collaboration with another D&D group and kind of swapping some stories, swapping some notes, talk a little bit about how our thoughts on D&D and that sort of thing. It's the original GM. You can find them on YouTube or on Instagram, all kinds of places, but we'll get more up-to-date socials at some point before we actually release the episode so that I can throw it on the stream. And other than that, that's pretty much it for the episode. Do you guys have anything else to share or plug?
Just make sure that you check out our YouTube channel for all of our past episodes. Make sure that you follow us on social medias at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, so on and so forth. We are podcasting, so you can find us basically anywhere that you listen to your podcast. So just make sure that if you like our content and you want to continue to support us, seek us out on other platforms and give us a follow there as well. You never know, we might start doing some content specifically for other platforms.
Or just give us a follow here, too. That'd be great, too, but whatever. Thank you, guys, and we'll see you again on Wednesday. I've been Ben, that's been Brian, and below me has been Brendan, and we'll see you again on Wednesday. Bye-bye.